Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Brennan Center for Justice's event here at New York University School of Law. My name is Wendy Weiser, and I direct the Democracy program at the Brennan Center, and I'll be your moderator today. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan think tank and public interest law center that works to reform, revitalize, and defend the systems of democracy and justice. And this past year, we've been deeply engaged in efforts to address what we see as an alarming assault on the norms and practices of constitutional democracy. And fortunately, we are not alone. So we are very pleased to welcome Yascha Mounk as our guest here at the Brennan Center to talk about his new book, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And before we start, a little background on Yascha. He is a writer, scholar, and public intellectual known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. He was born in Munich, Germany, to Polish parents, studied history at Trinity College in Cambridge, and earned his PhD in government from Harvard University, where he is now a lecturer. He's gotten a couple of other jobs as well. He writes a column for Slate, hosts a podcast, serves as a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, and is also the executive director of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And in all of this, he has managed to write 3 books, including the one we are here to talk about today. And this book has been a real wake-up call for many Americans, myself included, who at least hoped that American democracy was fundamentally resilient. In it, Yascha argues that Donald Trump is not an aberration, but a system of strains that are afflicting liberal democracies around the world, and strains that really present a fundamental threat and risk to these systems. And so before we get into why you think that and what we should do about it, I want to start on a personal note. You've written that your interest in this topic stems in part from your personal history growing up in Germany and as a journalist, and I was hoping you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me at this event. The last time that I was in this room, I was sitting somewhere sort of in the back there, and I looked at Tom Nagel and Ronnie Dworkin sitting up here discussing legal philosophy. So it's with sadness at the passing of Ronnie Dworkin that I'm sitting here, but also humbled to be in this room. Yeah, I mean, you know, the strange thing now is that it's sort of en vogue to talk about the crisis of liberal democracy and to take seriously the fact that our political system might be in danger. And to those of you who have checked your phones in the last half an hour, the fact that Mr. McMaster has just been fired and replaced by John Bolton is not likely to reassure people further. But I'll leave everybody to digest that for a second. This is not the best way of getting people to focus at the beginning of our conversation. But I'm in the strange position where I've actually, you know, I'm a democracy hipster. I've been warning about the death of democracy before it was cool to do so. And people would usually call me a Cassandra, to which my response was always, but Cassandra was right, damn it. That didn't always go down too well. So why is it that I was starting to worry, you know, a long time ago? And as you're saying, I think there's a sort of set of personal and a set of more political reasons for that. I mean, on the personal front, my family has had the bad habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time for about 3 generations. So I think the idea that political systems that might seem reasonably stable could prove not to be so stable, you know, didn't seem so far away from me biographically. I grew up in Europe, and obviously the rise of populism has been going on in Europe for a lot longer than it has in the United States, in part because of a difference of political system and systems of proportional representation. You've started to see populist parties break through much earlier. Think of Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, think of Jörg Haider in Austria. In fact, in a study I recently did with a colleague, Martin Eiermann, we show that in 2000, the average vote share of populist parties in Europe was about 8%, and now it's 25%. And that rise has been relatively steady and relatively continual over the course of those years. So I think being in Europe helped me see what was going on. But there was also academic reasons. There's been all of these things about our democracy that are really worrying, that everybody knows about. We all know that trust in politicians is very low at the moment. We all know that Congress now has approval ratings in the single digits. In fact, for what little that's worth, congressmen are less popular than lice or used car salesmen. We all knew that voter participation has tended to go down, that membership in traditional political parties in European countries is way down from what it was. But political scientists for a long time made this sort of neat distinction between what they called government legitimacy and what they called regime legitimacy. They said, people are getting more critical about particular governments, about particular politicians, but they have the same faith in the political system as such. Well, before Donald Trump was elected, before Britain voted to Brexit, with a colleague, Roberto Fora, I started to look at whether that was actually the case. And what we found there was really worrying. What we found was that actually a large number of older citizens really care about living in a democracy. About 2/3 of Americans born in the 1930s and 1940s do. But less than 1/3 of millennials born since 1980 do. We found that whereas 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans believed that army rule was a good system of government, now it's 1 in 6. And in more recent years, we've shown similar things about a whole set of European countries as well. So I think it's a mix of, these biographical things and the sort of particular direction that my academic interest took that made me the democracy hipster that I am today.
I want to take two of the things that you raised and go a little bit further. You talk about the reduced faith that people have had in their political system and their democratic systems over time, that it's been growing. There was a recent study that was just put out this past week by the Democracy Fund's Voter Study Group that purports to take this research into 2017. And they claim that under the new data that they see now a renewed support for democracy in the United States, and that it's gone back, they claim, to the levels in the mid-1990s. And they also don't see any difference between young people and older people in their support for democracy as of 2017. Have you had a chance to look at this? Does that give you more optimism or change your perspective on where this is going?
Well, yeah. So I've been in conversation with the authors of the study, Larry Diamond, who's a very important scholar in this field, obviously, my friend Lee Drudman at New America, and Joe Goldman, and I think they've done a great job trying to answer some of the questions that were left sort of unanswered in this research agenda. And there are indeed some positive headline findings. I mean, the most positive headline finding probably is that there's a cohort of young people, for they only have sort of medium young people above the age of 25 in the sample for various reasons, who seem to be reacting against the election of Donald Trump, right? Who have become a little less, particularly less open to the idea of a strongman leader, because they associate the question now very strongly with a specific individual they dislike and say, no, we don't want that. There's also a whole set of worrying findings, right? One is that this study confirms that the levels of discontent with democracy in the United States now are actually comparable to the kinds of levels of discontent you got, for example, in Venezuela in the mid-1990s, right? So actually the overall level of people who say, no, there's really something deeply wrong with our political system is still quite high. A second point is that young people are less supportive now of a strong leader because they sort of see that as a question about Trump, and most young Americans aren't very fond of Donald Trump, thank God. But they are actually quite open to alternatives to democracy. So when you ask them about various sort of alternatives to democracy, they still say, yeah, you know what, there's something that's really not working in our political system, and sure, I'd be open to something. And that, I think, underlines the point that we see in many other countries, which is that there are some populist movements and some movements that really do challenge the very basis of representative government, which are much more popular among young people than among older people. In France, in the last presidential election, over 50% of young people voted either for the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen or the far-left candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon. In Italy, many more young people voted for one of the three populist parties that did very well at elections a few weeks ago. the xenophobic League, the party of Silvio Berlusconi, or the Five-Star Movement than older people. And so I think this shows that Americans would be open to forms of populist politics if it didn't come in the shape of Donald Trump, which for all kinds of different reasons isn't particularly appealing to them. And then further, really worrying finding that comes out of this study, which we hadn't observed before, and which is, I think, a very important addition to our understanding of this, is that there is now, in a way that there wasn't, a partisan divide about the rules and norms of democracy. So 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, the likelihood that a Democrat said, I care about living in a democracy, the likelihood that they rejected the idea of army rule or strongman rule was about the same as the likelihood that a Republican would do that. Now Republicans are much more likely to take those views that are deeply critical of the existing political system. And that, of course, is very concerning because it shows that disappointment with our political system and openness to alternatives to it has actually become politically mobilized. And if that becomes a political divide that defines our country, it bodes very poorly for the continuation of democracy because it lives precisely of people agreeing on the most basic terms of a political system. I mean, to go back to the sort of large picture stuff, look, people sometimes make fun of Francis Fukuyama for proclaiming the end of history. Most of the people who make fun of him in that way, by the way, haven't read the book, because the book is a lot more subtle than that. But the truth of the matter is that most political scientists who would never have used a phrase like the end of history believed in a form of that thesis as well. Adam Przeworski here at NYU wrote a very important paper in the 1990s in which he argued that once a country has changed governments for free and fair elections a couple of times, once you have a GDP per capita of more than about $14,000 in today's terms, you're safe. You don't have to worry. And as some other countries become democracies over time, as they get more affluent, they're going to join the ranks. And so, sure, it's not the end of historical events, but the geographical area of democracy is going to keep expanding. And why was that supposed to be the case? Because democracy had become the only game in town, had become consolidated in a bunch of countries. What that was supposed to mean was that people had this commitment to democracy, that they weren't open to alternatives to democracy, and most importantly, that all of the major politicians and political movements that had actually had a real stake in the political system agreed on its basic rules and norms. Well, we've gone through the public opinion data on this, but the most important is the third one. When you have a president of the United States who in the campaign threatened to lock up his political adversary, who said that he would leave people in suspense about whether he would accept the outcome of the election, who is doing all of the things in government, like attacking the special counsel, undermining the independence of the FBI, attacking media and the opposition all of the time, well, then we don't have that consensus anymore. Democracy is no longer the only game in town. And so the intellectual basis for our assumption that it would continue to be stable in this kind of way is crumbling.
And so you talk about these two phenomenon that are symptoms of a decline in our democracy. One is the rise of strongmen, what you call populist leaders, and we'll get to that word in a moment. And the other is this decline in respect for democratic norms, and they're related. When we look at Donald Trump, he is rapidly undermining a lot of our democratic institutions and flouting the norms. But they're also distinct, and we've seen this erosion of norms well before Donald Trump took office. As you note, and as the Brennan Center has been working for quite some time on opposing the efforts to, for when political parties win office, for them to try to change the rules of the voting game or to redraw electoral districts to maintain their power regardless of voter will, for efforts to, if a party loses an office, to try to neuter that office or reduce its powers and not transfer power peacefully, treating opponents like enemies rather than just adversaries. So
Yep.
this is something that we've been seeing for quite some time, and it is not just related to this moment and to this sort of strongman leader. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you think, and you've referenced this sort of that established party leaders have already been ignoring democratic norms. What do you think accounts for that before this moment? Why have we been seeing that?
So let's talk about the nature of the phenomenon first and then some of the causes, right? I think the distinction between enemies and adversaries is absolutely key, right? Look, any politician is going to want to say, the government isn't doing a great job. I would do a better job, right? The incumbent isn't representing you in the right way. I would, right? That's the point of democracy, to make those kinds of claims. But there's a huge distinction between saying it's absolutely important that I win, I'm going to make a real difference to your lives, for all kinds of reasons I would be better than the person who's in charge now, and saying only I am legitimate, and the person who's in charge now is a traitor, or he is deeply corrupt. An enemy who disagrees with me is therefore an enemy of the people. One important moment in our relatively recent history, when that was nicely brought out, was in the last days of the 2008 presidential campaign, when John McCain was doing a presidential town hall, and a woman stood up and said roughly something like, you know, Barack Obama is an Arab and he's a dangerous man, and I'm scared of what's going to happen to our country if he wins. And McCain, to his great credit, said, look, it's really important to me that I win. I think I would do a much better job. I have very different ideas from Mr. Obama about what America should be doing right now. But you know what? He's a decent man. He's an honorable man. And if he wins, you don't have to be scared for your country. That is marking the distinction between a legitimate adversary who you really want to beat and an enemy who you have to destroy. And too often in our politics, we are starting to blur or cross that line. I'm skeptical of people who want to see continuity between Donald Trump and other politicians in the system where there is none. Donald Trump is a new phenomenon in the United States who's very, very different in the extreme ways in which he attacks our rules and norms. But there are some forms of continuity. And to be frank, there are parts of our political system, this has sometimes been the Democratic Party, but it has more often and more extremely been the Republican Party, who have become unwilling to accept the legitimacy of the other side of a political line for a long time. And the most striking example of this happened in 2016, but at the state level, among a Republican Party that was not particularly Trumpified, in North Carolina, where the opposition narrowly won, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate narrowly won, and the outgoing Republican legislature, that wasn't going to have a majority anymore, rewrote his job description, radically curtailing his power. That is the definition of saying, I no longer believe that I should be bound by the outcome of an election. And it's very concerning.
So you say that Donald Trump is a unique phenomenon. And so there are two questions I have about that. One is you refer to him as sort of both a would-be authoritarian and as a populist. And normally, and just to explain the terms, I mean, those terms here often sound like they're very distinct. An authoritarian sounds bad, against the people. Populist sounds good, for the people. Could you explain a little bit what you mean and why you use those terms and why they're connected?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think sometimes people get into debates about what this term means that have something to do with the fact that it has different historical connotations in different places. I'm going to lay out what I mean by a populist and just take the definition of, sort of assess the definition by whether you think it's coherent or not. It may be that you would want to use a different term for the concept I'm trying to outline, but just see it as the concept that it is, right? And I certainly think that some of the people who are commonly called populists, on my definition, aren't, and that's fine, right? Okay, so why do I think that there is a similarity? Why do I call populist people who are as different from each other as Donald Trump, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, and so on and so forth. Recep Erdogan in Turkey. There's obvious differences between those people. I think it's fair to say that our president doesn't appear to be overly fond of Muslims. Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, doesn't appear to be overly fond of anybody who's not a Muslim. So they don't share that. There are some populists who are openly right-wing in terms of economic ideology. They want to cut down the welfare state. They want to lower taxes for businesses and so on and so forth. There are other populists like Hugo Chavez who campaigned on increasing the welfare state and taking companies and corporations to task. So we don't have that in common, right? So what do they have in common? Why is it helpful to think of them under one category? Well, it goes back a little bit to what I was saying a moment ago. I think what populists share is a political rhetoric and a political imagination. What they share is the claim that the only reason why we have political problems right now is that the elite is corrupt and self-serving. And we would solve all these problems if only common sense, the will of the people, actually prevailed. And you know what? I, the populist, am uniquely positioned, am uniquely able to speak for the people in that way. I am your voice, as Donald Trump said at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, right? So, just trust me. Give me a little bit of power. Everything is going to turn out to be fine. One of the dangers with this is that the will of this majority is often directed against vulnerable minorities, and this is something that the Brennan Center is very aware of and does great work in trying to hold in various ways and shapes. But another problem is that that expression of the will of the people, once it's framed in this way, attacks the kinds of rules and norms and the kinds of roadblocks that we need in order to ensure that a president or prime minister doesn't become a tyrant. So what happens when a populist is elected? Well, first of all, they're not able to solve all of the problems they promised, and they say things like, who knew that things could be so complicated? Who knew that healthcare could be so complicated? Who knew that negotiating with Kim Jong-un might turn out to be complicated, especially when your main advisor is John Bolton? But obviously, they don't want to admit that they peddled false promises that they were never going to be able to keep. So instead, they start a very dangerous blame game. They start to say, why haven't I been able to deliver for you? Because the media keeps criticizing me, and they're dangerous purveyors of propaganda and fake news, and they need to be regulated. Why didn't I deliver for you? Because judges and institutions like the Department of Justice are un-American, they're enemies of the people, and they need to be brought to heel. Why have I not delivered for you? Because the opposition keeps obstructing everything I do, and they are traitors. Right? That is something that is in common. You know, if you have American politics in mind, you've probably been thinking about Donald Trump and a bunch of things that I've been saying. But if you are Turkish and you've been following Turkish politics, you were probably thinking about Erdogan. If you're Hungarian, you were probably thinking about Orban, because they have all of these things in common. So that's what I mean by a populist.
Now, I want to respond with two questions. One is just on the rhetoric. One of the things that strikes me is that the populists are building their claim to legitimacy as the voice of the people based on a critique of the establishment, sowing distrust in that establishment. And Donald Trump was railing against not only the media, but big donors. One of his pillars of his campaign was to drain the swamp. And in that respect, his critique of the system wasn't radically different from that of reformers, like the Brennan Center, who call for campaign finance reform, and others who think that there's been an accumulation of too much political power in the hands of a very small group of unrepresented people. And I'm just wondering if you think that reformer critique empowers somebody like Trump? Is it unhelpful? How should we be talking about the real risks of corruption without creating the conditions for somebody to tear down the whole system?
So look, if a stop clock is right twice a day, then populists tend to be right 4 or 5 times a day. But they're very rarely right in their solutions. When they're right in the description of on the analysis and the description of what some of the problems of our political system are. And that's because there's real public anger about the real shortcomings of our political system. And so it's not very difficult to tap into that. I think one way of thinking about this is that our political system has two basic elements. It's a liberal democracy. The liberal bit has nothing to do with liberal and conservative in the sense that I'm talking about. It's not about Barack Obama versus George W. Bush. It is precisely saying that you care about individual rights, about the rule of law and the separation of powers. The democratic element then just becomes an ability to actually translate popular views into public policies. It's that we actually do rule ourselves. Now, I think for a long time, the United States, but also many countries in Europe and most liberal democracies around the world, have been reasonably liberal with important footnotes, but they have largely been quite good at protecting the rule of law and even individual rights. But they've done a rather poor job of actually translating popular views into public policies. There's some very suggestive studies showing how little influence people with median income have on political decisions. We see the huge role that money plays in politics, the revolving door between lobbyists and legislators. We see the acculturation of a political elite who spend 50% of their time fundraising, the congressman, for example, and obviously come to have a deep instinctive understanding of the views and preferences of rich people, but not necessarily of their constituents. And going beyond that, now, all of those things we could fix. It's hard to fix, but we could in principle fix. It's easy to see how to fix it. It's just hard to make it happen. Right. There's a whole other set, which is really complicated and which I don't think we thought hard enough about, which I call the Technocratic Dilemma, which is that next to Congress being less responsive to popular views, there's also all of these institutions that have come into existence that are needed because they have great expertise, or because they facilitate international cooperation on issues like climate change, where we really need international cooperation, but that actually take important issues out of democratic contestation. So you get the rise of everything from, in this building, notably courts and the Supreme Court in the United States, independent central banks that have a lot more power than they used to, independent bureaucratic institutions like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Consumer Protection Bureau, trade treaties, and all of the constraining of policy that they do, international organizations. Now, again, the easy solution is to say, let's get rid of all of those things. And I don't think that would work. I think that would actually decrease the performance of governments in ways that would also make people angry. But we need to acknowledge that though institutions like the Consumer Protection Bureau have something important to add to our civic life, they also take something important away, which is that they take important decisions out of the hands of the people. Now, your question was, should we be talking less about that? No, I don't think so. I don't think that people are activated by the Brennan Center calling that out and talking about it. I think they're activated by the underlying reality of it. And we need to talk about it in order to figure out how to fix it.
And so the problems, there's two maybe separate sets of problems that you talked about, the technocratic problems of decisions being removed from the realm of democratic decision-making, and then separately, the democratic process is not producing outcomes that people respond to as well. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you see there as well.
About
the faults in the democratic, so in the electoral process.
Yeah, so I mean, well, so I think I've sort of, in a way, talked about those two things, which is to say that one part of it is, the role of money in politics and the revolving door between lobbyists and legislators and so on, which has the result, according to one study, for example, which has rightly received a lot of attention by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page, that when you look at 2,000 public policy issues over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, the views of, of selected interest groups, so of basically business associations and so on, are good predictors of what policy is going to get passed. The views of economic elites, which in that study they actually specify the 90th percentile of income. You would imagine that if you looked at the 9th percentile might be even more extreme, are pretty predictive. But the views of the 50th percentile of people have a statistically non-significant near zero impact on public policy, in their words. So there's plenty of empirical evidence for this. Now, I think another kind of set of questions is, well, what about the performance of our political system? Now we've been talking about the input, right? Is our political system able to actually translate our views into what happens politically? Another thing that really matters to people is just how well it's performing. Are they actually getting out of a political system what they want to get out of it? And a big part of my book tries to answer that question, right? So if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a quick story about a chicken. And it might not seem very relevant, but I promise you it is. It's the kind of chicken we'd all like to eat for dinner in these parts. Which is to say that it's organic and, got to run around its farm freely and chat with the other animals. And the other animals tell it, because this is a fable, be careful, one day the farmer is going to come and kill you. And he says, what are you talking about? The farmer is really nice to me. Every day he comes and feeds me, mutters some encouraging words. Why would he suddenly kill me? Well, Bertrand Russell, who wrote this story, points out in his dry wit that one day the farmer does come to wring the chicken's neck, demonstrating that more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. Why am I telling this story? Why did Russell tell this story? Because he wants to point out the scope conditions to how things happen in the social world, right? So as long as the chicken was too thin for the market, the farmer had an incentive to keep feeding it. Once it was thick enough to fetch a good price, he had an incentive to kill it. If we want to understand how it is that political systems around the world have been incredibly stable for 50, 60 years in the wake of World War II, and why it is that they're now ceasing to be stable by all the metrics that we talked about earlier, we have to ask the chicken questions. How have the scope conditions of democratic stability eroded or gone away? And I think there's at least three big things which have to do with, in part, with output legitimacy, in part with what the government actually does to deliver for people, that have really changed. And the most important of that, or the most obvious of that, is economic. From 1935 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. Since 1985, it's essentially been flat. It's been stagnant. Now, that makes a huge difference to how people think about politics. We never used to love politicians. We never used to think of Washington, D.C. as the paragon of moral virtue. If you had told them that, D.C. is a swamp, they may have believed you 30 or 40 years ago as well. But in the end, they said, I'm twice as rich as my parents were. My kids are going to be twice as rich as me. You know what? Let's give them the benefit of a doubt. They seem to be sticking to their end of a deal. Well, now that people have experienced decades of economic stagnation, they're saying, you know what? I'm not doing any better than my parents were. My kids are probably going to do worse than me. I don't know if I'm going to have a decent retirement. So, you know what? Let's blow this thing up. Let's try something new. How bad could things get? The obvious objection against this, which has been strangely prominent in public discourse over the past few years, is to say, yeah, but it's not true that you look at how much somebody makes and you can predict whether they voted for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. That's right, you can't do that. But what you can do very clearly is to look at which parts of a country are economically dynamic and which parts are economically stagnant, and that tells you a lot about who they voted for. So Donald Trump took 2/3 of American counties, but only won about 1/3 of America's GDP. He did much better in parts of a country that had very little recent investment, a much less educated workforce, even parts of a country in which the share of jobs that might be automated in the coming decades is much higher. And you see the same geographic pattern in support for populists everywhere, from Norway to Greece to Turkey to India. The second thing that's also important, obviously, is culture. And these two things go together. The world is not monocausal. very few interesting things have only one cause. If somebody falls in love with you, it's probably not just for one reason, and if they leave you, it probably has more than one reason as well. Now, in the country where I grew up, in Germany, when you go back to 1950, 1960, the country both was more homogeneous than it had been at many points in its history, for the obvious reason that there had been the Holocaust and genocide and expulsions across Europe. And even more so than the reality, it had a mono-ethnic, monocultural conception of itself. It thought of itself as everybody who belongs being descended from the same set of people. So when you asked a German in 1960, and the same would have been true in Sweden or in Italy or in most parts of Europe, you know, who really belongs? Who's really a German, an Italian, a Swede? They would have said, well, somebody who's brown or black obviously doesn't. Somebody who's Muslim or Hindu or Jewish obviously isn't. That, thankfully, has started to change through decades of immigration. The citizenship laws are now much more liberal than they used to be. People's conception of it in a large part of the population is somewhat different. But there's real resistance against that. And since this is a historically unique experiment, since there's actually never been a country that started a democracy with a mono-ethnic conception of citizenship and embraced a multi-ethnic one, that shouldn't surprise us. It also shouldn't surprise us because actually people have something to lose. If you're not the richest guy in the country, you're not the most educated guy, you perhaps aren't the guy who gets the most social respect. And it's very tempting to say, well, at least I'm German and I'm not one of those people in other countries. Or at least I'm a part of a majority and I'm not one of those Turkish guest workers, quote unquote. So once that Turkish guest worker or his kid or his grandkid is a politician or might be your boss, that takes something away from you. We don't have to condone that, but it shouldn't be surprising when you look at it as a social scientist that there's this counter-reaction. Now, the United States is both similar and different. It's different in that we've always obviously been a multi-ethnic society, but it's similar in that we've always been a multi-ethnic society with a very strict racial hierarchy. And so, again, we should remember how far we've come in overcoming that. I don't know that it was better to be a member of a minority group in the United States 2 years ago than it is today, but it certainly is better to be a member of virtually any minority group in the United States today than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. Let's celebrate that. Let's be glad about that. But again, it shouldn't surprise us that some of the people who have to give up some of the advantages they always had in American history might be angry about that, might respond to that politically. So if you take the bottom line economic anger that people have and you add to it the sort of rebellion against a multi-ethnic society, and then you add to that the rise of the internet and of social media, which makes it much easier for people to bypass gatekeepers like the New York Times, like NPR, and make the voices heard. Sometimes for the good, when you think of some of the students in Parkland High in Florida, for example, but often for the bad, because it's easier to spread hate, to spread fake news, and so on. That becomes a dangerous cocktail. The addition of that new technology, not on its own, but to the underlying frustrations, to the underlying sense that people have that the system isn't delivering for me, becomes very dangerous.
And before I ask another question, it is incumbent upon me to remind people that this is NYU's School of Law's Brennan Center for Justice program talking to Yascha Mounk about his new book, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. I am Wendy Weiser, your moderator, and you can follow us on brennancenter.org. We're going to take a few more questions, and then we will open it up for questions from those of you in the room here today. I want to switch to both your prognosis for the United States and then also what we need to do about it. So on the prognosis, you raised a number of problems both on the input side and on the output side. But that there are also some unique factors that makes the United States maybe different from some of the other countries that have seen democracy eroded. How resilient are we? How worried are you that the institutions are going to not hold up?
That's an important question. I mean, I think generally speaking, when I think of the three sort of deeper causes that I'm talking about, the economy, the cultural side, and the internet, I think the internet is a force that applies across contexts in very similar ways. On the economy, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the United States. I think there are absolutely things we can do to ensure that our economic system delivers better for people. I don't think it's a matter of changing our economic system. I think it's a matter of making it work for people. And I think that's possible. But the institutional and cultural roadblocks to that are higher in the United States than they are in other countries. In part because of a different political culture, and in part because of institutional and constitutional fact that there are just more roadblocks in the political system. There are more veto points than in other institutional setups because of the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court and the President, and each of them can veto it. That is the highest number of veto points of essentially any democracy in the world today. And so it makes it more difficult to change those kinds of things. Now I have to tell you, and this is not a common view right now, but I'm more optimistic on the cultural side than I am in many other countries like Europe. I think that for all of the deep cultural divisions we currently have about what a fair multi-ethnic society might look like, Americans, according to every poll you look at, are actually much more open to the fact that people can be true Americans irrespective of skin color and religion. Even the fact that the majority of Americans, according to recent polls, say not just diversity is a good thing for the country, more diversity is a good thing for the country. You don't have anything similar to those views in countries where that poll has been taken in Europe. So I think actually there is more baseline social consensus around the idea of multi-ethnic society in the United States than we sometimes remember. Now, in terms of the stability of a political system, I do think we have dangers. When you look at Hungary, this is a country that political scientists had declared safe 5 or 10 years ago, that scholars of Central Europe had thought would certainly remain a democracy for the foreseeable future. And yet, democracy there is now under very, very serious threat. If our current president was better at instituting the populist playbook that has been pioneered by people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Recep Erdogan in Turkey, he would be able to do very real damage to our democratic institutions.
Now, you outline a very long list of proposals of things that we can do about it, and I hope we'll have some time to get to most of them during the rest of the program. I want to just ask you what you think the single most important of the reforms or changes that you recommend here. If there's one thing we had to do first to actually get this country back on track, moving towards a stable liberal democracy, what would that be?
So look, as you're saying, there's a whole bunch of things I talk about in the People versus Democracy. So one is that we need to actually reform our political and intellectual institutions to make sure that we limit the role of money in politics and actually give people the sense that they have a real voice. Another is that we have to institute all kinds of economic reforms to give people the sense, in the words of the Brexiteers, the people who wanted to take Great Britain out of the European Union, that they can take back control, that they actually have control over their fate individually, that they know what's going to happen in their lives, and that they have a sense that the nation can stand tall in the age of globalization. And both of those things are possible without turning against capitalism or free trade or anything like that. But I think the most important thing in some ways is actually a cultural shift. One of those is around actually embracing patriotism and nationalism. I think there's a deep temptation to saying nationalism can do so much damage. It's done so much damage in the 20th century. it is doing so much damage in its exclusive form, in its incendiary form, as is practiced by white nationalists in these countries today, and unfortunately by parts of the White House as well, that we should just run away from it. And that temptation takes sort of two forms on the left especially. One is to say we shouldn't have any forms of collective identity. Why can't we just define ourselves as individuals, as, by whatever we do professionally, by whatever our musical tastes are, or whatever else? The second is to say, no. We should celebrate identity, but only at the subnational group. We'll celebrate every religion, every ethnicity, every sexual and gender group, but we should never celebrate the national group. Now, I think that underestimates the degree, first of all, to which nationalism has actually been a force to spread solidarity in the past. It's actually been one of the things that has allowed us to care about people beyond our immediate family, our immediate town, our immediate religious community, so that if there's a horrible flood in Houston, even though you might be halfway across the country, you say, no, these are my compatriots, I owe them solidarity, I owe them some amount of help. And by the way, if there's a horrible flood in Puerto Rico, you would think the same. That's a real achievement. And secondly, I think of nationalism as a half-domesticated animal. It is dangerous. It will remain dangerous in certain ways. But if we leave it to its own devices, the worst kinds of people are going to come in and stoke it and bait it until it really runs amok. So the much better response is to fight to redefine it. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, with whom I have a good number of political disagreements, I think expressed that very beautifully in a campaign speech in the city of Marseille, where he said, when I look into this room, I see people from Mali and the Ivory Coast and Algeria and Italy and Poland, but what do I see? I see the people of Marseille. What do I see? I see the people of France. Look here, referring to Marine Le Pen, the far-right populist, look here, ladies and gentlemen of the Front National. This is what it looks like to be proud to be French. That's a kind of nationalism that I can embrace, and another aspect of that is a real commitment to civic identity, which means that for all of the flaws in our political system, in our country today, which we should be upfront about and which we should fight to overcome, we also need to do a much better job of emphasizing what's right about our political system, why the values of liberal democracy are worth preserving and fighting for, and why it is much better to live today in the United States than it is to live in Russia or China or Venezuela. And that's, I think, a task for everybody, because we're no longer teaching civics in high schools the way we did. We rarely talk about what's good about our political system in college and university. And so fighting for an inclusive nationalism and fighting for the values of liberal democracy is something that everybody can make a contribution to.
And that everybody includes everybody in this room, which I think is a good segue to open up the floor to questions. I believe that we can just turn on the mics if you have, or is that, oh no, if you have a question, please walk up to the mic here. The mics around the room do not work.
So come on over.
Come on over to this mic.
I will start, though I can't guarantee that the mic will stay at the right height. Throughout the 20th century, these fights, these issues were broad ideological contests between camps around the world. You had, during the Cold War, and certainly during World War II, democracy against totalitarianism, broadly speaking. And you even had that in some respects in the 19th century. The liberal revolutions of 1848 happening all over the place, lining up with the anti-slavery movement in the United States. When people talk, for example, about Putin's interference in America's elections or even in Europe, people say, oh, he's just making trouble and trying to stoke distrust in the system. But at times, it seems as if there's a more troubling ideological dimension. Do you see camps forming throughout the world of liberal democracy versus the new strongmen, the new authoritarianism? And if so, which side is our country on, but what can be done about it?
You know, I wish that I saw camps forming, because what I'm seeing is the rise on the one side of a very clear ideologically self-conscious, quite effective illiberal international. There is now a populist playbook that can easily be implemented across countries, and populist movements are learning from each other. We see that through the deep institutional connections they have with each other, and we see that by people like Steve Bannon going on little grand tours of Europe, doing photo ops of all of the main populist leaders on the continent. Now, that's very worrying. I wish it wasn't the case, but given that this is now the case, I wish that there was a clear, ideologically self-conscious set of liberal democracies fighting for their values on the other side. But there isn't. Recently, the Russian President Vladimir Putin had himself re-elected in a fraudulent, cynical display of self-legitimation. And the President of the United States, and also the Chancellor of Germany, and also the President of the European Commission congratulated him on his election victory. This is not countries standing up for their values and actually saying, we are, at least, that you have to negotiate with Putin is obvious. But in international politics, you have to be respectful towards people you might not like. Fine. But at least we're going to call a spade and stand up for our values. We don't have a club of liberal democracies to fight the club of illiberal populists. We have a club of cowards cowing in front of the populists.
Thank you so much for speaking here. Talking about kind of Trump as a strong man, but that being there being a large precedent and a lot of social trends moving in that direction internationally and in the broad sweep of history, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of your prescriptions had to do with the underlying forces there around the economic forces. You did talk about campaign finance reform, but I think Wendy brought up a number of issues earlier, whether it was gerrymandering, voter suppression, and many loopholes within our democratic system that allow it to be manipulated, from the drawing of district lines to all these things that I mentioned. And I guess I have two questions. One is, do you see other problems with our system beyond campaign finance, the way that our democracy works, the actual tactics? And then I think my other question is looking back at previous presidencies and thinking about some of the precedents that they set and whether, the executive orders that President Obama passed, whether those might have set a precedent here and whether we need to fix how that works.
Yeah, those are both great questions. I think there's two slightly separate questions. The first point is that, yes, absolutely, there are people in the past, including presidents in the past, including people on the Democratic side, who have overextended the power of a presidency, who have broken important rules of our democracy, who have done things like gerrymandering. And we need to call them out on that. At the same time, we need to stay away from false equivalency, right? The fact that there was very attenuated forms of that in the past doesn't mean that what's happening right now isn't sui generis and isn't unique and shouldn't be taken more seriously. But I think it shows actually the importance of the much mocked line by Michelle Obama that when we go low, we go high. That's hard to do when we are under extreme attack, but we certainly want to get back to a political system where both sides go high. Right? One way of thinking about this is what happens if you're trying to play American football and the opposing team turns up with 50 guys with baseball bats in town who are threatening to beat you up. Well, it's a hard dilemma. If you just go and play football and they beat you up with baseball bats, that's not going to end well. But if you get your own 50 guys with baseball bats, you're sure not going to be playing football. So you somehow need to get to a situation where both sides disarm. And that's really important and difficult. Now, to the second question, yes, there are very important ways in which American democracy is institutionally deficient, and they can be fixed, right? It's not some miracle that Americans don't pre-register their voters, that they vote on a working day, that you have much longer lines to vote in urban counties that just so happen to be predominantly African American and so happen to vote for the Democrats, than you do in nice suburbs where white Republicans go to vote, right? Those are deliberate political choices. And it's going to be hard to fix that because of a lack of political will, but it's in principle easy to fix it, and it's obviously very important to fix it. The same goes for gerrymandering, the same goes for a whole bunch of other things. But what I would say is that people who focus too narrowly on this set of things, I think, overlook the international context. Because you have lots of democracies in which you don't have gerrymandering, you don't have voter disenfranchisement and all of these other problems, but the populists do very, very well there as well. So just fixing those things is not going to solve the underlying problem.
My question is about the term populism. I've read a little bit of George Lakoff, and I've come to believe for now that the language we use is important. And even granting that technically your definition works, I'm still curious, what were other terms that you consider? And I like that, if you talk about government of, by, and for the people, that's, for me and for many others, very inspiring. That sounds very close to populism. So I'm wondering, what were some of the other terms you considered? Why did you come to believe that populism was the best one to use?
So I didn't consider alternative terms. For if you can come up with one, I'll happily use it. But look, I mean, the populists have a history that goes back a very long time. The first populists probably were the populares, the people who said that they would stand for the interests of the ordinary man and return power to the people in ancient Rome. And they elected one Julius Caesar, who didn't do very much for the people and ended up with dictatorial power. So it has a very long history, and it is called, and those kinds of political movements have been called populist in many parts of the world. Now, obviously, in the United States, there's a specific populist movement that actually, on my definition, some of the populists would have been populist in my definition, some wouldn't have been. I understand that this is a difficulty in the American context, but since the term populist has been in use for millennia in that kind of sense, and since it's easily recognizable in most countries around the world, and since it is also commonly in use in the United States in the second meaning, I think the slight conceptual confusion is a bullet worth biting, because I'm not sure there's a better alternative.
Thank you very much. I'm visiting scholar at NYU and the coordinator of the Human Rights Commission of the University of Zulia State in Venezuela, and the NGO Aula Abierta, Open Classroom. So, as you mentioned, sometimes the situation of Venezuela, I wonder, in the context of the international community, how to protect democracy in Venezuela, considering first the gross violations of human rights, the civil and political rights, and also the economical, social, and cultural rights, considering that there is not division of powers. All the branches are controlled by the executive power, the government as well. Considering that the anti-politics is in a growing process, with general mistrust of the population about the political parties, and especially considering the general frustration from population regarding the economical situation and the breakness of the institutionality. So,
I'm a little hard pressed to give anything but a flippant answer to the question of how you protect Venezuelan democracy. And the flippant answer I would give is a time machine. As I think your question brings out very well, there is no longer democracy in Venezuela. And there is no longer democracy in Venezuela because somebody who absolutely fits the bill of a populist, even though he was left-wing rather than right-wing, as most of the famous populists are right now, took power, said that he alone spoke for the people, that he was going to return power to the people, and did nothing of the sort. So I think there's a few lessons we can take from that. One is that, yes, we do need to be worried about populism in all of its forms. We should be skeptical of the people who celebrated Hugo Chavez as the great solution to all of Latin America's problems and have gone suspiciously silent about him in the past years. But there's a deeper problem which you raised, right, which is what do we do now, right? I don't think that there's anything the United States can do right now to protect democracy in Venezuela, or not very much. There is some things that the European Union can do in Poland and Hungary. That's limited as well. In the end, I don't think whether Poland and Hungary are going to rescue their democracies or not depends on what the European Union does. the idea that the European Union cutting off its money to Poland and Hungary would suddenly make everybody rebel against the populists there, I think is naive. The idea that by doing that we somehow hugely strengthen the hand of Viktor Orban or Jarosław Kaczynski is also naive, because they already have a very, very strong hand. But that means that we can at least stand for our principles, that we can at least say we'll preserve the nature of the European Union, which would be irrevocably changed if we continue to tolerate countries that are ceasing to be democracies in our midst without acting against that. That is already being irrevocably changed by the fact that moderate political parties like Angela Merkel's CDU continue to be in a faction in the European Parliament with Fidesz, the party of the Hungarian, I would say, dictator, right? So I don't think that we can wave a magic wand and institute democracy in Venezuela. For your sake and ours, I really dearly wish we could. But we can at least be clear about our principles and not mince words about what's going on there.
We are running short on time, so I ask that everyone else make their questions very short.
Hi, Diana Campbell, activist, but I'm very involved with the Democrat Party. And I'm nonpartisan also. I have to go across the board because I lobby for certain things. A lot of people feel that the Democrat Party and the Republican Party is at threat. And I want to know, what is your opinion on the IDC independent parties compared to, there's a fight here, especially in New York City, with the IDC, with the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. Where do you think this is going? Because it seems like people just want to come in the middle and not do either Democrat or Republican. I just want your opinion on that.
So, I mean, what we've seen around the world is that people have really strong negative partisanship, which is to say that they really hate the guy on the other side, but they have less and less strong partisanship, which is to say that they have less and less like for the guy on their own side. And this does create openings for new political movements and parties, and we see that everywhere. From the Five Star Movement in Italy, a party founded by a comedian a few years ago that is now the strongest party in the country, to Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, who has pulverized the French political system. I think I am actually more open to the idea that this might happen in the United States than most political scientists are, because I see it happening in so many other countries. But the US has some unique institutional obstacles to that. And that is, first of all, the two-party system and the electoral college, which means that if at the federal level you had a reasonably successful third-party candidate, it might deliver the presidency to somebody who had 30% of the vote on the other side. And so voters are going to be very reluctant to take that risk at a moment where politics is really polarized, and the main goal of people who are not fans of Donald Trump is going to be to get rid of him, whoever it is on the other side. So I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very quickly, please.
Sure. I've been a software engineer for about 20 years now, and I'm looking at horror as we've almost created, my generation has created what I'm calling a crisis of truth. And I just want to know what your perspective is on that, particularly with an eye towards history. How can we, and really I as a professional, like, how can we transcend that? How can we solve that problem?
Well, one thing is to push whichever company it is you may be working for and other companies in the field to take this problem seriously. I think for too long, tech companies have thought of themselves as obviously and without question forces for good in the world. And they do some very important good things. But they haven't been alive in a serious way to the damage they can do. And if they take that more seriously, then I think they should, first of all, enforce some of the existing rules. This is both true of existing legal rules for, say, how they should handle their data, and for the existing community guidelines that companies like Twitter and Facebook have about what should govern behavior on their platforms. So they don't actually enforce. So that'd be the first step. I think we also need to have a more serious dialogue with government, which involves helping government understand what tech can offer to them, which is real, but also involves understanding that they need to be regulated in ways, and that that is a reality of every industry, and it's going to be a reality of their industry as well, and they should actually seek that dialogue in a good faith effort.
Hi. So in your description of the conditions that promote democratic stability, you referenced the post-war period and how the kind of generational upward mobility at that time gave people a sense that things were going well and that they could trust politicians and that democracy was working. But my understanding is that was a pretty unique time economically, and that sort of economic growth isn't necessarily guaranteed moving forward. So I wondered if in your research you had encountered any cases of places that had managed to develop democracy or protect it during times of economic stagnation, and if there were any lessons we could learn about how to continue to promote those values at times when the people aren't benefiting so much economically.
That's a really important question, and I think an important research agenda that somebody should pursue. The problem with it is that there's not many cases to look at, right? So basically, through all of the history of democratic stability, you've had a bunch of things actually at the same time, but particularly these two facts, which is that stable democracies were quite affluent, and stable democracies gave their citizens a real optimism about the future and a sense that their living standards were rising. Now, if we're lucky, the stability was produced by the affluence, and in that case, we might continue to be fine, because we're still going to have more than $14,000 GDP per capita unless something really disastrous happens in the next couple of years. But we're probably not going to have that sense of real forward motion. And I fear that that is a lot of what actually produced the democratic stability. But there's no easy way of answering that question empirically, because there's very few cases where that was the case, and there's even less evidence on what did stagnant societies do to actually remain politically stable. So it's a really important question, but one for which there's not many answers in the historical record.
Thank you, first of all. I have what I might describe as a more philosophical question, but one which strikes a cynical note, and which I hope you'll have a convincing answer to, because I haven't been able to think of one. You show convincingly that democratic systems are less stable than we think in the 20th century, and that assumptions about democratic stability, assumptions from the 20th century and from much earlier, that we have to reconsider them. And the reality in countries all around the world bears this out. My question is, how should this apparent lack of stability inform our fundamental views about the virtue of democracy in the first place? So you can see why this is sort of a devil's advocate question, but even going back to the founding fathers and some of the seminal figures in the liberal tradition, like Tocqueville, these people write not only about the liberal values of democracy, but also about the fact that it's supposedly the most stable political system. Now, if it's no longer the case that democracy is the most stable political system, to what extent have we removed one of the central arguments in favor of the democratic system at all?
That's a perceptive and smart question. Look, I mean, I think that liberal democracies, to an extent we have sometimes underestimated, have always lived of their performance, right? The nice narrative is, why did people care about democracy? Why did they come to embrace democracy, for example, in Germany after 1945? Well, because it has wonderful, grand ideals, because it promises each of us individual self-rule, and it promises all of us collectively to determine our fate together. And that's what people are really motivated by. Well, I don't think that's true. I think a lot of the reason why people were motivated by democracy is that democracies were the most powerful countries in the world, democracies were the most stable countries in the world, and democracies were the most affluent countries in the world. If you wanted a good life, you wanted to live in a democracy, right? There's a famous chant that the East German protesters held in the fall of 1989. It went something like, kommt die D-Mark, bleiben wir, kommt sie nicht, gehen wir zu ihr. which is if the Deutschmark, the sort of symbol of West German economic might, comes to us, so if affluence comes to us, we'll stay put, but if not, we'll go over to the West, right? That was a lot of what motivated people. Now, I would distinguish that empirical claim from a normative claim, which is to say that I think that there's enough in liberal democracy that is worthwhile, but I'm going to fight for democracy even if I think it's not that stable. I don't think that there is a political system that allows people a more dignified life. And yes, you have to have a minimum of economic well-being and all of those things to have a dignified life, but once you have that, as you now do, thankfully, in huge parts of the world, I still think that a political system that actually allows you to say what you want to say or not say, to worship whichever God you want to worship or not worship, to be in a relationship with who you want to be in a relationship or not be in a relationship with them, and something where there isn't somebody who's born to be better than you, a monarch or a dictator or a priest who gets to tell you what to do for the rest of your life. A system in which you have individual self-determination and collective self-rule is superior to anything that I can come up with. So even though I fear that many people have your foot, they say, well, if this is not going to be very stable and I'm not going to be a lot wealthier, why not go for autocracy? I fear that that people will turn on democracy potentially. I still would want to defend it.
So
I'm convinced. I hope others are too.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I think that is now our last question. I'm hoping that maybe we can end on a more optimistic note, and so well, maybe throw out a couple of things. One is, well, Donald Trump has been a strongman populist, as you've described. He hasn't been an especially effective one at consolidating power or undermining the institutions, at least so far. And you know, there has been some, you know, as we've discussed, change in public opinion. Is it possible that as people are looking down into the abyss, that they're being shaken from our complacency, that maybe there is some hope now of rejuvenating this vision of liberal democracy and not, or are the sort of constituent conditions that led us to this place still so prevalent that we're still at serious risk?
So at the end of the book, I lay out 3 basic scenarios to what might happen now. And one of them is indeed optimistic. It is to say that perhaps young people will start to recognize what they had in the political system once they see it threatened. Perhaps strongman rulers and authoritarian populists are going to rule so disastrously that a ton of people are going to reject them, that we actually have a great coming together of a population in rejection of that kind of politics, and that we might have real social healing. I don't think that's particularly likely. I think that as we're seeing in countries like Italy and Peru and so on around the world, even once particular authoritarian populists have been chased out of office, they can often make remarkable political comebacks. And even when particular authoritarian populists really are flushed out of a political system, they can have all kinds of successor movements, whether ones led by their family members or whether ones that have no institutional link to them, but that can see, oh, you know what, I can violate all of these rules of a political system and nothing happens, and that actually works pretty well. Let me do that from a different part of a political spectrum. And my fear is that in that sense, Trump is going to turn out to be concept of proof and be emulated. Now, the second scenario is a really pessimistic scenario, which is to say that Donald Trump will start to emulate the authoritarian playbook more effectively than he has done over the past years. I think if he did that, our democracy would really be on the rails. We've already seen the extent to which any amount of consensus, by the way, no matter what you think is going on at the FBI, any amount of social consensus around the importance of that institution and the independence of that institution has been destroyed. And that's something that you have to agree with, even if you think it's not Donald Trump who's at fault for this, right? That in itself is incredibly worrying. I would also argue that it's concerning that you see the deep partisan nature of Congress under Republican rule, that the Republican Party is now unified behind Donald Trump. So there are some worrying signs. And by the way, 1.5 years into the rule of Recep Erdogan in Turkey, 1.5 years into the rule of Viktor Orban in Hungary, most of the smart people in those countries and most of our newspapers covering those countries said they're good for democracy. Not much to see here. So I think the threat to our democracy remains much more real than some people want to acknowledge. But I don't think that's so likely either. In the end, as you were saying, Trump is not very good. You know, if populism was a sport in the Olympics, Trump would not come close to the medal ranks, thankfully. So I think that my fear, and I promise I'll turn around to something more optimistic in a moment, but first of all, the semi-pessimistic scenario is the Roman scenario. That what we're seeing here is the election of somebody like Tiberius Gracchus in the late Roman Republic, who channels real popular anger, real popular grievances, really goes outside the bounds of the constitutional system, is swatted down by the system, in his case violently. Things go back to somewhat normal for about 10 years in that case, but then a new incarnation of that same populist energy comes back and challenges the system. That's swatted away again, but there's the zigzag that goes on for decades. The underlying problems are unsolved, and by the end of it, Roman democracy or the Roman Republic is dead. Here's the optimistic bit. And I know, people always tell me when I talk about this stuff, your talk was great, but it was so depressing. So I'm conscious of a need to try and counteract the depression. Look, I actually think in certain ways this is an optimistic story. It is optimistic about what we can do and the significance of the decisions we make right now. When I was growing up, I thought politics mattered. I thought there was a whole bunch of economic and social issues I cared about, and I thought it mattered a lot whether my political side won those or lost those. But I also thought that, it was obvious that 20 or 30 years from now, democracy would be stable. The significance of my actions was limited. Well, now, I think what we do really matters. Because whether or not liberal democracy is going to survive is not some abstract intellectual question that lies out of our agency. Unlike the citizens of Russia and China and Venezuela, we still have the liberty to fight for our political values without fear of censure or torture or prison. So let's do that. I went to a talk by Amos Oz a few months ago who had the very nice image that there's a big fire burning right now. And each of us only has a little glass of water in our hands. And it can feel hopeless to go and pour the water on the fire. But you know what? There's a lot of us here in this room. And if each of us has a little glass of water, and each of us pours that on the fire, then together we might just be able to extinguish it. So no, I can't promise a happy end. In that sense, what I'm saying is scary and depressing. But what we do matters now, and together we can try and put out the fire. So that's what we should try to do.
And on that note, I would like to thank very much to Yascha Mounk for coming to visit with us and to talk with us about his excellent book, The People versus Democracy. He will be signing copies of his book afterwards. I am Wendy Weiser. Please look up the work of the Brennan Center for Justice at www.brennancenter.org. We look forward to pulling out our glasses of water and fighting with you for the future of our democracy. Thank you.